All right, good morning, everybody. Glad that you're here. You're the diehards, the ones who are here on a snowy, cold day after the project is due. A lot of people think, oh, I did the project, that means I can sleep in today, but you're the ones who love learning, so thanks for being here. I'll give you the secret information that we're having a pop quiz on Thursday. It's not much of a pop quiz if I tell you in advance, but since half the class isn't here, it'll still be a pop quiz for them, right? Okay. So we're having a quiz on Thursday. Most likely it'll be something related to what we've been doing recently. Hey. So that's a hint there. Your next homework assignment, homework number 12, if you look at the schedule, it says that it's due before class on Thursday. But once again, I'm going to push the deadline of that back a little more than a day to give you some additional time. Even though the assignment is confined to things we've done before with payback analysis, we've previously touched on payback analysis twice this semester, and so this will be the third time that we're looking at it. And today we're going to be doing, excuse me, I switched that. We've done break-even. Well, we've kind of done payback analysis. In any case, we're doing some more of it today. We've done it in the past, but the assignment is due on Friday. Question?
Is that where you take like a sum of money from the bank or whatever, and then you pay it back, and then you count for the interest to go back up? Okay.
So yeah, I can see in your mind you're visualizing the curve that showed us how the interest goes up, then you bring down the unrecovered investment balance. Yeah, you remember correctly. It's that analysis, and so we're going to be dusting off that and doing a related calculation today. But first, I wanted to just briefly go over one of the spreadsheets that I saw. I took an early peek at some of the submissions that were uploaded yesterday, and I found one that I thought had a really good spreadsheet, and so I'm going to be doing my best to grade, 2 or 3 a day is what I like to do. That way I don't get burned out. You don't want to be having your project graded at the end of 20 in a row, because then the instructor would be all burned out and irritated and not in a good mood. And I try and be in a good mood when I grade these projects, so I just do a couple each day, and so it'll probably take me a while to get through them, not too long, but I wanted to show you a spreadsheet that I thought looked really good. And so this had a couple of different tabs, this student's work, and you can see that this is the tab that's called main, is the spreadsheet formatted the way that I asked to see it in the assignment description. So for each year there's an income amount, there are expenses. You can see that the extraordinary expenses only come along occasionally, and so we'll talk about each of these. Then the amount saved each year is the difference between the income and the expenses. The investment yield is based on the cumulative savings balance and a weighted yield rate that's kind of the average of all of the investments. And so there was a lot going right on this spreadsheet, where the cumulative savings balance is going to be in any given year. It's last year's balance, the amount that came in this year, and then the interest that occurs based on last year's balance. So all the formulas are set up correctly here, and since that's not always the case, I wanted to show you a little bit of some of the things that were right about this. You'll notice that the income amount is going up each year, and the multiplier that they've used of 3% I think is a pretty reasonable and middle of the road assumption of what your cost of living adjustment could be on an annual basis. But then you'll notice that in some years there's more than that 3% jump. If you look at this student, what they assumed from year 4 to year 5, the 3% on last year's, and then an extra $12,500. And I think it's realistic to have occasional raises built in. Maybe this one would coincide with becoming a licensed engineer, for example. After 4 or 5 years, maybe you go and take the PE licensing exam, and suddenly you're more valuable to your company because you can start stamping plans. So in the report, which I've also looked over, the student explains the basis for the starting assumption on income and explains the details related to the raise. And so, the income column, is really good, and you notice that at the end of the, well, I'd have to refresh my memory on how it tapers. I guess this might be related to Social Security. Yeah, so it's steady. All right, so then the expenses are likewise going up, and if we look at the cost column, there's lots of good details here, breaking it up into different categories, and each one of these categories in the report, it talks about how it was calculated. And so they're going up each year, and here's the inflation factor that's used. One thing that I really like to see is that this student didn't forget to account for taxes. And that's an expense that sometimes it's easy to forget because we don't like it. We feel like we're not getting anything out of it. You know what would happen if you stopped paying your cell phone bill? You wouldn't have a cell phone provider anymore. But taxes can be tricky, and so the taxes are one of the expenses that's going to bring down your income that's available for savings. And so I wanted to point out taxes because sometimes people forget to account for that effect. And so each year has all of the total expenses that are accounted for. One of the things that's kind of cool is that with Excel, you'll notice these little green tabs here. If Excel detects that a trend has been interrupted, it'll put the green tag in the corner there just to draw your attention to it. And so where it's all of a sudden multiplied by 2, I'm assuming that there's a second person in the household, and so that's why maybe the utilities are twice as expensive as they used to be. Here you can see the income tax calculations, and what this student did, they went above and beyond and found the income tax rate. When you are earning between $0 and $9,700, then your income tax due is 10% of that taxable amount. But then the more you make, for any additional dollar beyond $9,700, then you're now paying a higher marginal tax rate. So the student was basically calculating their income taxes based on the costs that you'll actually experience. And then the weighted yield is where they're thinking of a few different investments and what the return of each of those are. So this is just one example. I'm sure there's lots of other good spreadsheets out there, and I'm excited to look at them, but I wanted to show you one that I give a thumbs up to. It was well explained and well justified, and so I hope that it was a useful experience for you to consider your financial future. I found in the past that when students see the effect of compound interest and realize, oh shoot, I could have $1 million by the time I'm 50 years old. Once you see that, then it makes it easier to actually find an incentive to save. Saving always, have you ever heard the phrase pay yourself first? There's this phrase that don't pay your rent first, don't pay the landlord first, don't pay the electric company first, pay yourself first. And what that means is the first priority that you have should be taking some of your money and putting it into a savings account so that in the future you've got it available to use. And everything else will take care of itself. You'll naturally spend all the money that's left over. Don't save what's left over, spend what's left over. And so if you make savings a priority, that's really the only way it's going to be possible to save $40,000 in a year, is if it's a priority. Because if you just keep spending until the wallet's empty, then you won't end up with $1 million by the time you're 50 years old. But if you make it a priority, then you can, and then that gives you some real flexibility. You have far fewer concerns and problems in life if you're driving a paid-off car, if you're living in a paid-off house, then your boss is yammering. Just in the back of your mind, you can think, I can walk away from this job anytime I want. It doesn't really matter. I could live for 10 years on the money I've got in the bank. And that really helps. You can sleep well at night when you know that you could live for 10 years on the money that you've got in the bank. You could take your time finding the next opportunity if you've got some of this walk-away money in an account somewhere.
My parents told me, like, on saving money, they usually set a limit, and they try to reach that limit on saving money, and then they take a list, and it exceeds, and they set a new limit, exceeds.
Yeah, having goals is important. Absolutely.
One of the advantages of saving money like that is that investments are generally better the more money you have total.
Yeah.
Like, I was looking at some stuff, but for example, the credit union gives a pretty nice rate if you take like $100,000.
That's true.
In CDs, like it'll give you like 2.5%.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, the more you have to invest, the more anxious they are for your business, and you get a higher interest rate. Sometimes they'll give you a sign-up bonus, free toaster, a free gun. In Texas, there are banks that'll give you a free gun if you open up an account with a certain amount of money. I've never seen one in West Virginia, but yeah.
That was actually another thing when I was doing on the investment yield.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about doing a stock from Chase Bank and then a CD, but determining the value of each one from investment yield got a little confusing, so I had to stick with one option.
Well, I think the more realistic thing is to have a balanced portfolio where you have a little bit of money in a risky investment like a stock, a little bit of money in a middle-of-the-road investment like a bond, and then some of it into a guaranteed FDIC-insured investment like a CD or a savings account. Most people will just naturally do that as you get into the saving years. Now, it may seem like you're never going to be in those years where you've got a surplus, because right now you're spending more than you're making in most cases. In fact, if you calculated your cumulative savings balance right now, if you've got loans, then that's going to be negative. And that can be discouraging, but it can also, the more you see the data, the more it's going to guide your behavior. There's a saying that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so I found in my own personal experience, I started adding up my assets when I was in your shoes. When I was in college, between semesters, I went and got a job, and I was on commission. And this was like in the late 90s when a lot of people were getting their first cell phone. I was selling cell phones on commission. And it was like shooting fish in a barrel. These guys would come around the kiosk in the mall. They didn't know anything. They just knew their wife needed a cell phone. And it was just like I was signing up people left and right. So I got a fair amount of money, and I put it in the bank, and I just couldn't believe I had this money in the bank. And so I just was compulsively checking it because I didn't want it to go away. I mean, I didn't know where it was going to go. But I got in the habit of checking my balance at least every week. And then I found that I'm not going to go blow a bunch of money at a restaurant, because then my numbers will go down. And it's not like I'd even set a budget for myself. I just didn't want to see those numbers go down. And so you just kind of naturally, without thinking about it, will begin to change your behavior when you have data. And everybody here is quantitatively oriented anyway. You're in engineering, and so that means the numbers mean something to you. And so going through the habit of adding up your assets and your debts on a regular basis is going to naturally steer you back onto that productive path. And so I'd encourage you to consider that habit. All right, so I guess I'll get off my soapbox. It's 8:15. We better move on to the course material. But I hope that the project was useful for you. What we're going to be doing today is considering a what if. So every company or investment opportunity has some initial costs. And let's say that we're going to be considering the case of a steamroller. And it has a certain initial cost. And to purchase that, you're either going to take out a loan at a certain interest rate, or if it's your own money, remember there's some second best alternative that you could have been doing with that money. And so the opportunity cost rate of return, if you're buying the steamroller, that means you can't invest it into a CD from Chase Bank, and so you'd set that as your minimum acceptable rate of return. And we know that a certain net revenue is going to be generated each year by the new equipment. Otherwise, if it wasn't producing additional profits, then we wouldn't bother with the opportunity. So with these three numbers, then one of the ways to analyze and to draw comparisons is to ask the question, how long until the loan can be paid off fully? And so that's considered the payback time. So payback analysis asks the question, how many years do you have to operate the equipment before it's paid off? Now, you can't do everything with this type of analysis, but it can answer some important questions. And you'll remember that we've looked at certain things like this before. When we did the calculation of unrecovered investment balance, what we were doing is we were saying how many years until this initial investment plus the effective interest is paid off by the annual revenues that we're putting back into the same pocket that we took the original investment out of. So if you're repaying yourself, then you can think of it as you're paying back yourself plus the opportunity cost that was missed. Or if you're paying off the bank, when we're doing this payback analysis, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to pay off the loan and then also some additional rate of return that we get to keep ourselves. So the crossover point is the payback, but hopefully you operate the equipment longer than the payback time. If you only operate the equipment for exactly the payback time and you borrowed the money, then that's like you've given all of the profits to the bank if the equipment lasts only as long as it takes to pay it off. So we can calculate this payback period, and the book assigns it the variable n sub p, number of years for payback. And it's the amount of time for either the revenue, which is the additional money that's being generated by the equipment, or the savings. And remember that the way that we handle savings to previously experienced costs is we consider those to be the same as money that's been made. So if, for example, if you put insulation into an old building and it brings your heating costs down, then you consider that difference between the old costs and the new costs as the revenue that's justifying the insulation purchase. So those savings can also count towards calculating the payback period. So you're wanting to cover the initial investment plus a rate of return. Now, remember, simple interest is when you have a 0% loan. And so the simple payback time would just be where you're dividing the amount that has to be paid off by the annual amount and finding out how many years. But the problem with simple payback is that it doesn't account for the time value of money. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that the revenue in the future is worth less on a dollar-by-dollar basis than the dollars that were spent in the present to purchase the equipment. Because remember, money is becoming less valuable over time because costs are going up. So a dollar in the future doesn't mean as much as a dollar today because it won't be able to buy as many things. And so that's why simple payback is usually, in fact, none of your homework problems have to do with simple payback because we're going to be discounting the future revenues. And so you're discounting them at a specified interest rate, and that'll either be the interest rate that you're having to pay on the money that you borrowed, or it's the MAR. And we want to find out when is there equilibrium between the inflows that's justifying the project and the outflows to its initial purchase. We can use the payback analysis for initial screening, and the question you have to ask yourself is, does the equipment last longer than it's going to take to pay off? And so that steamroller, if the equipment only lasts for 7 years and you're not going to pay it off for 9 years, then initial screening would tell you reject the project. So the decision criteria, remember that phrase, decision criteria, when we use payback analysis, the initial screening decision criteria is if the useful life is greater than the payback period, accept the project. But if the useful life is less than the payback period, reject the project. So that's one of the ways that we can use payback analysis. We have to be careful, though, about how we use it for comparison. When we have two options and we're comparing steamroller from Caterpillar with the steamroller made by the Bobcat company, we would have to compare them very carefully because it's only valid as a comparison tool if the equipment has the same useful life and if it generates the same annual revenue. And so in that case, you'd select the alternative that can be paid off quickest, and by definition that would be the cheaper alternative. If they both generate the same revenue and if they last the same useful life, then really the only difference between them would be the capital recovery, meaning the initial purchase price versus the salvage value at the end. So be cautious about how you use payback analysis for comparison. And the reason why we have to be so cautious is that payback analysis, when you're just calculating the number of years to pay it off, payback analysis doesn't account for what happens after the item is paid off. So If one piece of equipment is paid off after 6 years, but it lasts for 12, if you were just going to pick the thing that's paid off quickest, the one that's paid off after 6 years maybe would be a second alternative to one that's paid off for 5 years. And you'd say, well, I'll pick the one that's paid off sooner, the 5-year equipment. But then what if the 5-year equipment doesn't last as long as the equipment that's paid off after 6 years? So you can use it for initial screening to determine maybe both of those options are acceptable, but then you have to use some other method to identify which one's best if they had different useful lives. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So here's the activity that we're going to go through today. Now this one we're doing, at first we're going to use the table lookup factors, which are on the back of the page. So you'll notice in part A you use the table lookup factors, but then in part B and part C you're going to do a unrecovered investment balance spreadsheet. And so I give you the column titles to set that up: year, amount, PV amount, unrecovered investment balance. And so you may want to go back to, if you don't remember how to set that up, the in-class exercise where we solved that one. I think it's in class exercise 12 if I'm not mistaken, but I think you'll be able to remember just from the column titles how to get started. I give you a couple of hints on the screen here. In the box in the red text, some hints on how to do both of those.
because you have interest. It must have been when I dragged it down that it went up by 1. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4.
All right, so from the spreadsheet solution, we see that the equipment's going to be paid off. After 15 years, it's paid off, and you've already got some profit. After 14 years, it's almost paid off, but that's not quite enough. And so it's the same crossover point that we identified by looking at the factors, by looking at the ratio of P to A, where it said the ratio needs to be 8.364, and then we looked in the factor table to find how many years gives us that crossover point. NPER function, if we want to verify how long, so part C says to use the function equals NPER. So let's just try that. So equals NPER. So you're solving for the number of periods at an interest rate of 8%, where the recurring payment is 11,000 and the present value amount is negative 92,000. So we have a present value and we have a payment value, and it's going to solve for the number of years to bring those into equilibrium. You'll notice it says 14.4 years. Now the reason why I didn't have to manually correct for the sign is because in these values where I'm calling on the amount in the cell, I had a negative amount for the present value and a positive amount for the revenue. And that's what Excel is expecting to see, is an initial purchase that's a cost and then revenues that are positive over time. So it says 14.4 years to come into equilibrium. All right, so in part 2, once you're ready for that, what we're trying to do is compare two pieces of equipment. And remember that the unrecovered investment balance can only be used for initial screening. And this in-class exercise, the purpose of it is to kind of just illustrate that, why that's the case. Why you can use the payback time for screening to know if an alternative is acceptable. You know, if the thumbs up, thumbs down for an alternative, you'll get the same thumbs up with payback time as you would with present worth analysis. But this is an illustration of why you can't use it for the decision. Why you couldn't pick the alternative that has the lowest payback time and have that be the one that's the most profitable. You'll see why after working through this in-class exercise. For part 2, you're going to do the same kind of analysis as we did for part 1. So I'll put up the template. You know, the column titles should be year, amount, PV of amount, and unrecovered investment balance. And so you're going to do one of these for machine X, and you're going to do one of those for machine Y. And then we're going to look at the comparison between the two to find out which one has a faster payback time. So in year 7 we have to buy it again. All right, so the thing about machine X is that you can pay it off quickly. You notice that you pay it off after 6 years, whereas machine Y, you don't pay off until 8 years. But then the problem with machine X is you paid it off after 6 years, but then you have to buy another one because its useful life, according to the problem statement, is just 7. So in year 7, this is the last year that it's operational, so you have to buy another one as well to have it ready for the following year. So you had a positive unrecovered investment balance, but then it goes negative again until it's paid off. So on an absolute basis, which one is going to make you more profit? It's machine Y, because at the end of the cycle it has the higher unrecovered investment balance. And just as a reminder of how we use the NPV function, remember when you do NPV, you should only put amounts that are in the future. You shouldn't include an amount that's at year 0. The amount that's already at the present needs to go outside the NPV function. So you'll get the same amount as the final unrecovered investment balance when you do the NPV. That's not coincidental. So we can conclude machine Y is the best alternative for a 14-year project. Even though machine X pays off quicker, machine Y is going to generate more profit if you're going to have to go through a 14-year cycle.